will defend the academic thesis, The Differing Drivers of EU Electricity Policy, Policymakers' Insensitivity to External Factors between 1986 and 2018. Mr. Bostan, may I invite you to present a brief summary of your study and the conclusion of your thesis within about 15 minutes.
Projekte Konselman, highly esteemed opponents, promoters, professors, friends, family, online colleagues, and distinguished audience. It is an honor to present today my PhD thesis entitled The Differing Drivers of EU Electricity Policy, Policymakers' Insensitivity to External Factors, 1986-2018. Electricity is widely used in numerous sectors, but it cannot be stored in large quantities, which makes it a particularly challenging domain in a peculiar market. Often, the solution to such challenges conflict with each other. For example, countries and companies are likely to store an extra supply of gas than normally needed in order to avoid any disruption of the gas supply to consumers. However, the cost of storing this extra supply must be added to the price, making the gas more expensive. Too much focus on affordability may become a vulnerability for the gas supply. Conversely, too much emphasis on security of supply can affect price. So where is the balance? What factors drive you, policymakers, to balance towards one goal or another? This dissertation investigates such fundamental system imbalances in the electricity domain and inquires what are the external factors to which policymakers in the EU electricity domain are most sensitive from 1986 to 2018, along the lines of the classical energy trilemma. To clarify, external factors are quantitative indicators, such as electricity prices, which are aggregated at EU level and have a multi-decade statistical history. I named them external factors to separate them from internal factors, which may result from the internal mechanic of EU institutions. So what? Why is this research question important to answer? It contributes to a better diagnosis of the challenges of EU electricity regulation, including indicators or policy fields which may be overlooked. It provides hints to anticipate legislation, and particularly for advocacy professionals, offer a better sense of what stimulates the attention of policymakers. To tackle the central concern of the thesis, I developed 3 analytical steps. First, I needed to develop an understanding of the policy instruments that have been employed over time, that is mapping. 2, to compare against external factors, juxtaposing. And finally, to validate the selective factors as drivers of EU electricity policy, and that is interpreting the data. Now, the first step. I began by looking at how EU electricity policy evolved over time through examining the individual targets and instruments of electricity policy. This main insight of this investigation was that various drivers of EU electricity policy may depend on its purpose. For this reason, I looked at the policy involved according to policy priorities suggested by the classical energy trilemma: affordability, sustainability, security of supply, to which I added a 4th, internal energy market. To clarify, the concept of policy priorities balance stems from the classical energy trilemma, which, as you know, proposed that 3 major dimensions of energy policy: affordability, security of supply, and environment, which I call them in the thesis pillars. Those find themselves in a precarious balance, often in competition with each other. There are different ways to look at policy instruments. The way I did was to look at targets and objectives from the legislation and refine them, and I will explain how I got there. In short, there is policy outcome and policy output. Policy outcome, probing if the policy adopted solved the problem that it was supposed to solve. And the policy output looks at policies taken into response to societal problem. I selected policy output, the latter, because it allows for easier quantification. The policy outcome opens the door to two new policy analysis perspectives, the policy density and policy intensity. Policy density, which is the number of laws put in place to reach a policy goal, and policy intensity, which focuses on the content of the legislation. However, different policy instruments have a different impact. So I added a novel analytical perspective called policy importance by grading each target and objective according to a rule book. In terms of methodologies employed, the thesis relies on quantitative studies in order to find drivers of EU electricity legislation. I chose this because it ensures objectivity and repeatability and applies some new methods of analysis from the security of supply domain. The method for this first step was document research, which resulted in an empirical legislative database covering binding EU legislation in the energy and environment directories from Eurolex. The time period I selected was from 1986 to 2018, about 3 decades. This can be resumed in the legislative map that you can see on the screen. The results for the first step. Is the EU electricity policy in balance? Pillar environment ranks first with about 40% of all laws, policy instruments of policy importance. Affordability has 19%, internal market about 34%, and then security of supply 6%. The results are generally consistent across other lenses of policy analysis, policy density, policy intensity, and this clearly shows some policy gaps. The imbalance in the energy trilemma is noted, but why is this happening? Why environmental policies are getting more attention than others? Now we'll go to the second step, which is to compare against external factors. And this step involves an investigation of the sensitivity of EU policymakers to external factors, postulating that sensitivity or insensitivity of policymakers to certain key external factors may be a cause for environmental priorities being favored over other energy priorities. I tested this theory by contrasting sensitivity in between the changing policies and the variation of external factors. You can see here in this matrix the range of external factors taken into consideration, such as public opinion, intra-EU trading, or minutes of unscheduled, undelivered electricity per customer. We have found a relatively close legislation response to external factors for security of supply and affordability, and modestly for internal electricity market. For environmental, the legislative response were rather weak. For instance, a decrease in external factors pressure does not mean a decrease in legislative response. The findings display that EU policymakers are far less sensitive in their policy response to changing environmental factors, contrary to affordability or security of supply pillar situation. To give an example, greenhouse gases per capita decreased and air quality significantly improved, but did not cause environmental policies to be adopted at a reduced speed. So, if major indicators do not influence the environmental pillar in the electricity field, what does influence it? And here we go to the final step, the missing link. It was possible to observe a linkage between legislative response and security of supply and affordability, but for the environment, external factors seem to have no influence. This final step aims to fill this gap in our response to the quest of finding factors to which policymakers are sensitive, but focusing only on environmental drivers in the electricity field. We tested different factors. We can see them in the table, such as timing of different elections, International Panel on Climate Change, treaties, or the number of staff in DG Klima and DG Environment. I felt quite an investigator, as they told me I was the first ever to ask this kind of data. The outcome of the empirical study of the 6 factors shows that organizational factors, meaning the European treaties and characteristics of the problem, defined as framing of the problem, such as the wording used, seem to influence the legislative output the most. Some guidance regarding environmental policy is given by political factors, such as the timing of European Parliament elections. Our question was, what are the external factors to which policymakers in the EU electricity policy domain are most sensitive? In relation to affordability and security of supply, the response is rather well calibrated, and for the security of supply, we have the public opinion, the electricity prices, household energy expenses. For affordability, again, public opinion, undelivered electricity, and fossil fuel dependency. Internal market, again, public opinion, intra-EU energy trade and market coupling. And finally, for environment, which we studied separately, it is the European treaties, the timing of European Parliament elections, and the framing of the issue. Now, if I had to resume the findings in one phrase, I would say that the legislative response is far less sensitive to environmental indicators than affordability or security of supply, even though the environmental legislation is far higher in the policymakers' attention. About the impact, the thesis comprised two innovative empirical contributions: a database of all targets and objectives in EU electricity legislation, 1986-2018, an application of a new quantitative analytical framework taken from applied from the field of security of energy supply. Theoretically, the main contribution of this thesis pertains to the reassessment through empirical testing of different approaches that seek to explain the dynamics of EU energy policy making. And from a policy perspective, the findings of this thesis reveal the importance of public opinion in adopting new legislation. For most energy policy priorities, European policymakers are swift to embrace new legislation in response to the development of public concerns. And finally, future research agenda and recommendations. Adding further empirical data to the database beyond 2018 would improve the accuracy of the results and allow further insight. Since 2018, lots of things have happened. We have a new Commission president, new energy package, and now an energy crisis. I would say more interesting would be to study the approach of EU institutions facing the increase of energy prices since late 2021. As the increase of energy prices is one of the influences factor, I expect that EU legislation to be adopted in the security of supply and very possibly the affordability pillar. Also interesting to see to what degree the growth of green policy ideas influences the adoptions of European environmental legislation in the electricity field. And finally, framing of the problem seems to have a strong impact. There are studies suggesting a link, and our empirical findings hint towards such a connection as well, but more research is needed for definitive results. Thank you for your attention. I hope you find the findings interesting, and I give the word back to the prorector.
Thank you, Mr. Bostan, for your presentation. We will continue with the opposition. The opposition will be opened by Professor Esther Versluys, Chair of European Regulatory Governance at Maastricht University. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Dear candidate, congratulations on this really well-written and well-researched manuscript. It offers a unique insight in the development of EU energy policy over time, and I really particularly appreciate the empirical contribution of your work. The collection and the analysis of these, well, some 300 pieces of binding EU legislation in the electricity sector, covering a period of several decades, it really provides a unique insight into the developments in this sector, so well done. My main question when reading your manuscript relates to the way in which you treat the EU policymaker. And I think this particularly relates to Chapter 3. It appears to me that you assume that there is one type of EU policymaker. But of course, we all know there's no such thing as a EU policymaker. We all know the influence of on policymaking very much varies between Commission, Parliament, Council officials. And can one really draw conclusions the way you draw them now without opening up this black box of the EU policy process? What has been the individual impact of each of these types of bureaucrats? It is perhaps to be anticipated that Parliament officials will be more likely to be sensitive to environmental factors. And also now in your presentation, you very strongly stress the role of public opinion. Is public opinion likely to influence a Commission official similarly to a parliamentarian, to a Council Secretariat official? Particularly all these external factors that you identify, I think, are likely to have varying impacts on the different types of EU officials. So my question is twofold. First, am I correct in my interpretation that you treat the EU policymaker as if there is just one type? And second, would you most likely conclude differently if you would open up the black box of the EU policy process and analyze the unique contribution of Commission, Parliament and Council officials?
Highly esteemed opponent, this is actually one of the concerns I thought a lot, how to measure, how to make these comparisons between the external factors and the legislation while we have this black box, as you name it. And after a lot of thinking, the solution that I found is to use this policy perspective analysis of policy output. So I just took the legislation approved, binding, from the Eurolex, and avoid the internal mechanics of how this legislation got to be approved. I thought to add this as well to the PhD, but to the thesis, but the analysis of this would have been another PhD in itself, and I guess this would be for further research. I totally agree with you that there are different EU policymakers, and there are different, could I say, center of power that collaborate and contest each other in developing the EU legislation. We have the Commission, we have the Council, we have the Parliament, we have the entire galaxy of policymakers. And the way to eliminate all those unknowns and to focus on these comparisons would have been just to focus on the policy output. And I agree, there are different policy makers that will have a different dynamism, and the way to avoid this is to focus on the policy output, the legislation that is adopted. As you can see, it's not the legislation that is proposed, but the one adopted. In terms of external, how I treat EU policymakers, all the institutions are just given the label EU policymakers because the analysis of the legislation starts from the approved one, the one that is in Eurolex.
Slight brief follow-up, if I then can pose a critical question. Can you then really say something, as your subtitle concludes, on policymakers' sensitivity or insensitivity?
I think this is a very good, highly esteemed opponent, I think this is a very good question. I think, yes, we can still say that we talk about EU policymakers because that would encompass all the European institutions. It would be very interesting to divide how the influence of different factors would be to each of the institutions, to each, I would say, level of EU policymakers, but that would mean further research. Personally, I would be very interesting how to measure the council, for example, the council political leaning, the more socialist or green, in comparison with the public opinion of the legislation proposed. But as I mentioned in the thesis, that is one of the limitations of it, because there is the the increase of the members of what is now the European Union, and there are different governments that maybe change even during a presidency of one, and that would make the analysis too complicated. I would have loved to do it. It's just that it was too much. This is indeed a limitation of the thesis, but I think the question can be responded.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Leigh Hensher, Chair of European Law at Tilburg Law School, Tilburg University.
Thank you very much. Dear candidate, thank you very much for offering us this fascinating study. I was really impressed by its breadth and depth. I'm an energy lawyer. I've worked in the electricity field for a long time, and this book was fascinating for me to read. Of course, my questions are more from the legal perspective, but one of the things that I think is interesting reading your work and looking at what's happened on one pillar of policy, which you cover, the internal market, you conclude that we see less legislative output, at least up to 2018, when we look at that pillar as compared to the environmental pillar, if I'm reading your thesis correctly. But I wondered, and of course it gets back a little bit to the black box, and you can't do everything in one thesis, but when I look at the evolution of the internal market legislation, it began in the 1980s and eventually took form in the 1990s with abolishing things. And I think you don't need too many measures to abolish things. That's a rather easy thing to do, abolishing barriers. But as time has progressed and we want to set something up based on standards and interoperability, we have a plethora of legislation. Maybe not all in the form of regulations and directives, but there's a huge amount of delegated legislation. And even within the category of delegated legislation, there are even more sub-instruments that are legally binding as well. So I found it difficult to conclude that in terms of quantity at least, the internal market legislation, even focusing purely on the goal of creating trade for electricity between the member states was, in terms of output at least, something that you could say was lower than the environment. I think it depends on what you measure, and I wondered if you could clarify that point for me. Thank you.
Highly esteemed opponent. Yes, this when I thought about the scope of legislation, and I had to give some boundaries to what I could measure, and the boundaries that I've added was to be in the electricity domain, so not energy but electricity. First we have a boundary, and then to be binding, so no guidance or recommendations, but it had to be binding. So. And that replies to these questions. Binding, I took directives, regulations, council decisions. I didn't look at delegated acts or RTS, regulatory technical supplementary acts, what we call level 3, because only taking the regulations, directives, decisions from Eurolex, that was more than 300 pieces of legislation, more than about 800 targets and objectives, and tagging each of them in order to allow measurements. It was about 8,000 tags. And I had also a practical problem. My laptop couldn't process more because of the Excel became so big, and then you had another sheet where you try to put the charts and see what they say. This book presents the raw database. there are a lot more other Excel sheets of Excel there that do those measurements. I agree this is one of the limitations of the thesis, that it doesn't look at delegated acts or what generally level 3. However, I think that the decisions, the regulations, the directives give the direction, give the big objectives, and we can make assumptions or make conclusions based on these major objectives. I would say furthermore, because of these targets and objectives are graded, it's one objective to have the Commission report on UETS to the Parliament. This is an objective, a task. And another thing is to have a binding renewable energy sources in a member state or at EU level. I think, and this is why I think I came with this refinement in order a bit to balance all this level 3 that is not in the scope of analysis. But I agree with you that it would be very interesting to look also at RTS, because it contains a lot of quantitative targets and a little more fascinating. Maybe I was thinking to do maybe a kind of a study case afterwards, take a particular box, a particular square, and analyze it more. But it's already like 400 pages. That maybe afterwards I can do this.
Maybe that would be a good idea, because actually what we're seeing in energy policy is some of the most crucial debates where public opinion is really important taking place at that third level. If you look at the debate on the European taxonomy, for example, what is sustainable, that's taking place at that seemingly very technical level, but that has huge consequences for the output. So I hope you can do it. Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Israel Solorio, Professor of Political Science at the School of Social and Political Sciences, Autonomous University of Mexico. Thank you also for joining us online at 2 o'clock in the night.
Thank you very much. Well, dear Mike, dear colleagues, it's a pleasure for me to share this defense with you all, despite the distance, of course. Mike, I enjoy very much reading this manuscript, which I have to say it's very ambitious in its goals. Congratulations for your work. Well, my first question is the following. In chapter 3, in your second paper, one of your main concerns relates to the external factors affecting the sensitivity of the EU policymakers. However, I could not find a solid definition of what you mean with external. And in your empirical findings, you operationalize external factors as public opinion. Can you further explain this decision, which, from my perspective, leaves aside relevant external factors that you also mention in your work, including climate change and the Conference of Parties, gas crisis, and diplomatic conflicts with Russia, rice prices, etc.? Do you mean external in the sense of Easton's black box in the political system is with societal demands outside, or in the sense of external factors outside the EU control, for example, climate change, Russian or the Russian energy policy? Thank you.
Highly esteemed opponent. This is an excellent question, because I thought a lot, and I had many debates with my promoters as well about how to find the external factors, because there is so much that you can look, and you cannot just pick at luck. And what I needed for these external factors was to be measurable and to have long enough time series to cover 20, 30 years of data in order to make the measurements valid. And also they need to be relevant. So I took inspiration from 4 places, and I will start with external factors, then I will respond to the public opinion questions. And I took inspiration for external factors actually from the analysis from the security of supply domain, because in the last, this is quite recent, 5-7 years, and what they do is actually looking exactly at the classical energy trilemma levels of affordability, security of supply, environment, and they pick different indicators, quantitative indicators, and they start to measure to see what is the level of security of supply of a country. And this is done in many parts of the globe. And I'm happy that I did this for Europe. And that was one source of inspiration out of 4. I took many of them. The second was actually looking at environmental policy integration literature, and they had actually mentioned in much of it several of the factors that I used. So this is coming from literature. And the third was looking at the theoretical framework, and this is where the idea of public opinion arrived. And fourth was actually looking at the definitions of the classical energy trilemma and see what can be used as factors. And doing this kind of, looking at all 4 levels, this is why I took those. The idea to have 3 factors per policy pillar and then aggregate them in order to avoid different disturbances is an analytical way coming from this security of supply domain. Related to the question on public opinion, luckily the European Union has the Eurobarometer, which asks European citizens their opinion about energy, and particularly also on those three lines. Do you prefer more affordability, security of supply, or environment? And this Eurobarometer is yearly. Sometimes there are some special cases where they do it more, and I put it all in the. It's all described. The problem was how to measure all this. The Eurobarometer, to take the Eurobarometer data and compare it with the legislative time series of objectives and factors and how you grade them. And luckily, this security of supply analysis provides this ordinal scale of data, and which allows this kind of measurements. It's very heavily, it's a lot of calculations and tables there, and I had to pay a lot of attention, but I think it provides quite interesting and measurable and objective way to have those two compared. I was very keen to have repeatability, so if someone else wants to look at the data or continue it or want to check it, all the tables are there, and you can see the calculation and the formulas and so on. I took it 1 to 10 to make those comparisons in order to ease. And on public opinion, why is this important? It was described in the theoretical in the theoretical part how important it is to have those public opinion in order to change the opinion of the legislative of policymakers to adopt new legislation. I hope I didn't miss anything.
Thank you very much, Mike. Just a brief follow-up comment. I think for further research, you will win greater leverage for inference, connecting external factors outside the EU, for example, climate change, with the public opinion inside the EU. Thank you very much.
Yes, so what I want, the external, when I meant external, what I wanted to make to differentiate between the internal, let's say, negotiations or policy work of of the European institutions before adopting the legislation and what comes out. And so the external doesn't really mean necessarily outside the EU. I would say external is referring to outside the negotiations or the political metrics that is before the adopted legislation. The factors themselves are linked with the EU in terms of looking at, for example, public opinion is public opinion in EU members. However, I think the principles rest the same for the entire world. You can, I don't know how to measure, for example, public opinion of the world. There are ways to do it, but for other factors like international price of electricity and other factors, it can't be measured. So in a way, it is possible. I didn't, for those factors that I used, they are related to the European Union, but in principle, they can be used if there are time series for that for world level, outside the EU.
Thank you. So we will continue the opposition, and next is Dr. Anita Spencerova, Associate Professor of Political Science at Maastricht University.
Thank you very much. Dear candidate, dear Mike, congratulations. This is fantastic research, and the current energy crisis only highlights its salience and importance, looking into this balance of the different policy objectives: sustainability, affordability, security. It's on top of the policymakers' agenda, and of course, we as members of the public and academics who are also very much interested to learn more about this. So your thesis makes a very welcome contribution to this burgeoning academic debate and also to the societal debates. It was a pleasure to read your thesis. My question comes into unpacking a little bit more, perhaps the linkage between the discursive effects, the legislative output effects that you very meticulously detail with your impressive database of the targets and objectives of EU legislation in the electricity field, with the actual policy impact. One of the theories that you engaged with is the punctuated equilibrium theory, and it talks, of course, the punctuated equilibrium theory about legislative impact, but also about policy impact. So my question is to think a little bit about especially the spikes of environmental pillar legislation around the years 2001, 2013, 2015, that you document again in your database very clearly. So clearly this is a short-term discursive legislative responsiveness effect that we see. You also talked about it in your presentation. I want you to think about what are the lasting, maybe policy impacts of these spikes of legislative activity. Can you unpack these a little bit more for us, since the thesis is also so insightful empirically? Thank you.
Esteemed opponent, I was actually very curious on that as well, to see why there are some peaks for some policy levels, for some policy pillars. For environment, it actually varies. I think in 2001, it was just a lot of legislation in the environmental field, not the most important in all years or with the most targets and objectives. It's just in terms of volume, a lot of it. And why that happened, I think it's related to the Treaty of Nice that was signed around that time. And I find that in my thesis that the signing of the European treaties is a factor in determining new legislation, in adopting new legislation. And I think another peak, which I think it was around 2013, it was more related to the importance of legislation. I think in 2013 there were a lot of targets and objectives. There was a lot of work related to the EU ETS and putting the EU ETS on the move. A lot of legislation related to the EU ETS directive. I think a lot of binding legislation to member states to measure it, to present it. Also, I think there was good development in terms of limitation of air pollutants for power plants. It was an important piece of legislation, and also because it has a lot of binding targets. And why was the reason for that? If I'm not mistaken, there were European Parliament elections in 2014, and I think this is a reason, also identified as a factor. The members of the European Parliament, I assume, just wanted to get the job done and present to electors something that they did, and this legislation is adopted, and the environmental policy objectives are on the right track. And for 2015, if I remember correctly, that was a year where there was not the highest policy densities, not the highest legislation adopted, not the highest objectives or target, but was really important 2015. I think in 2015 was the Paris Agreement signed, right? 2015. And I think that was one of the reasons, because there was council decisions on that and a lot of work on that to again have more had the legislative structure in place to allow, in a way, the signing and implementation of the Paris Agreement. So this is related to climate as well. It's not only that, there's also legislation which is not insignificant related to the Industrial Emissions Directive and so on, and the emissions from medium power plants, which is not that much, let's say, known, but it's quite important for the electricity generation. And I think that would be for those particular peaks in environment. There were other peaks as well, but are generally related to the factors that identified. Usually it's either a European treaty that is signed or a European Parliament election around that time, which determines these peaks, particularly for environment. And I would say that in terms of what determines these peaks in terms of legislation, if you go inside them, it's mainly related to the EU ETS directive and all the legislation that results from it. If you look at the legislative map that I made, it's also a PPX, so and all the legislation is linked dynamically one to another. So if you move a bit the EU ETS directive, you see a lot of other legislation linked to it, which moves as well. This is one of the important ones. This is another aspect of the thesis that would be very interesting to see what pieces of legislation are most important based on that, but outside of the scope. Further research. So that would be the ETS, and the second part is the air pollutants from power plants, small power plants, medium power plants, generally from power plants, and the national member states' national ceiling of pollutants as well. I think those two and national ceilings from member states as well. Well, after 2018, we have the governance of this as well, which would be very interesting to see, but it's after 2018.
Thank you very much, very helpful.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Sophie van Hohenacker, Chair of Administrative Governance at Maastricht University.
Thank you very much, dear candidate, dear Mike. Also, I would like to join my colleagues in congratulating you with a very rich and well-researched PhD. And I think your defense could not have come at a more topical moment. EU energy policy and specifically also EU electricity policy is very high on the agenda. As I'm working in the field of EU external relations, and I'm particularly also interested in the increasing geopoliticization of the different dimensions of EU external action, I would like to zoom out a little bit. Well, of course, we know that the war in Ukraine has catapulted the issue of energy supply to the top of the EU agenda. And also there is a realization that we have to rethink EU energy policy. This is more urgent than ever, I would say. And in that light, I have a double question. So if you would extend your research to the year 2022, how do you think, how would this affect your findings. And could you reflect a little bit on both, well, perhaps the continuities, but also the differences? And perhaps you can structure your answer along the different drivers, the different policy targets and objectives, and also perhaps also reflect a little bit on what could we see differently in or similarly in public opinion. And then perhaps linked to this, of course, because your thesis also has an important policy dimension, what would be your advice to today EU policy legislators? Thank you.
Highly esteemed opponent. Well, a lot to think of. Extend your research to 2022. Yeah, the last year I would say it was quite eventful, to say the least. And how would my findings and would reflect on that? This was actually one of the things that puzzled me as well, to test the theory. So we have this huge change of variation of external factors caused by these disturbances, war in Ukraine, high electricity prices. And I say here that these findings give hints to anticipate legislation. Well, this data stops in 2018, and it predicts that because of electricity price dependency on fossil fuels, there will be legislation on affordability and security of supply. Where in 2022, do we have legislation in security of supply and affordability? And I would say we start to already have. We also had the pandemic and so on. But related to the war in Ukraine, yes, so in a way, this was tested. And I say that the environmental pillar is not linked to the greenhouse gases emissions and all the other factors that you normally think of. And indeed, we have an increase of greenhouse gas emissions because the coal-fired power plants are producing a lot more, which is reflected in the EU ETS price and so on. So indeed, in a way, the findings are consistent with what is happening now, which was very alleviating for me, saying that I didn't know when I wrote this about current developments, and I was curious if this applied. So that would be the extent of the research to 2022. About what can be done differently, what can we see differently in the public opinion? One of the factors that I mentioned greatly for all levels of the policy pillars was public opinion. And what we see now in the public opinion, that generally, I haven't seen the Eurobarometer, but what I've seen in the press is that people say that the electricity prices are unsustainable, just too much. And having this public opinion pressure on legislator, I would say that definitely the European Union will put forward legislation on the affordability front to limit the electricity price. And I think no later than Friday was a council meeting of the UN energy ministers when they proposed a price cap of inframarginal generation, which is an idea coming from Iberia. They proposed liquidity relief for companies for trading, and support for vulnerable customers, which would be more of an extension of the support of energy of vulnerable customers. And if it goes through, maybe some kind of platform to, well, we'll not call it destroy demand, but let's say optimize demand in order to reduce the amount of electricity that is consumed in the system. So indeed, there is a lot happening on this particular field of affordability. In terms of recommendations, I thought of two. My first one is to not forget the long-term objectives of the European Union, particularly in the field of climate and environment, and because I argue in the book that the causes of current electricity prices are actually short term. It's the war in Ukraine, which is a big disruption, and the way the clearing system works, trading worked, which contributes to the energy price. But we should not disassemble all the good work that was done over, I would say, 20 years, 30 years now, and keep the long-term objectives of the Union in place. Because in effect, in a way, the climate policies were now vindicated, because this means more security of supply, because this happens in Europe. It means better for environment, less greenhouse gases emissions, and affordability, because we see that the cost, we didn't know at the time, 10, 15 years ago when it started, when RED was first, in 2001, I think, when first RED was adopted, that the cost actually reduced. That's one thing, to keep the long-term objectives, and the second is to keep the market design as it is, and maybe work more a bit on the balancing market. And how to say this? You don't throw the thermometer out because you don't like the weather outside. And this is what some proposals are coming, like freeze the EU ETS price, or put a cap on electricity price, or totally change the market design. Yes, it can be improved. Yes, there are parts that can be done better, but it provided a lot for Europe. We have the internal market, which provided a lot for consumers, very good competition. It's not perfect, but we built it so far to get here, and just change it totally and would actually allow, would remove competition, would be actually worse for customers in the end. So those two would be my recommendations.
Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Francesca Colli, Assistant Professor of European Politics at Maastricht University.
Dear candidate, dear Mike, I can only echo everyone else in saying that this was a very impressive thesis to read, particularly empirically. Gathering so much data, mapping all the electricity policy across decades is really impressive, and it was a pleasure to read. My question goes back to the methods and the methodological choices that you made. So throughout the thesis and also in your presentation, you highlight the innovation in using a quantitative method, and I can agree that it's a really strong point of the thesis. But I think many of the questions have also highlighted some of the limitations, given the complexities of the factors that influence policy output or policymakers, or however we want to phrase it. And so I would be interested in hearing your own reflection on maybe the limitations of the method you chose, what it couldn't tell you about policy output and about the factors that influence it, and how you weigh these up against the advantages of the path that you chose. Thanks.
Esteemed opponent, this is actually one of the saddest parts, because researchers you want to do a lot, and at some point you feel like, I can do this part, and this is really complicated. And what frustrated me the most, and I put it in the limitations in the book, there are two things, and related to policy drivers. One would be insufficient data. For example, the presidency of the Commission. I was really curious to see if we have a change of the Commission president in 30 years. Will that change in any way the adoption of legislation? Well, there were only 5 in 30 years, so this doesn't help a lot until 2018. And that would be one. And the second would be sufficient but disorganized data. And this is related to a question earlier. For example, I was super curious to find out if the composition of the Parliament, European Parliament, for example, the more green policy that is adopted, or even the parties in the European Parliament, will affect in any way the adoption. And here I go to the black box that was mentioned earlier. I really wanted to do this, but when I started to actually put the data together, I realized that the European Union expanded over time, some countries left, and how to do it, and afterwards I just give up after like 3 months of work on that. Unfortunately, the data is there. It's just that it's so disorganized that you cannot put in one place. And I was really curious to find more about that. I think these two are the biggest limitations. And related to methodology, I would say that not having this kind of these limitations in external drivers, in policy drivers that I could study was a bit of a limitation that I was quite frustrated by. But maybe someone else or me can pick up and see a bit more of this black box. Also, it would be interesting to see more about the public opinion influence of different parts, and one thing that definitely for further research and a big puzzle for me is, and I really have to describe this well. So we have the GDP growth, domestic product growth of European Union, and it matches absolutely like a statistical dream matching the European the environmental legislation outdoors. It was like this for like 20 years, and in 2007, totally opposite, totally changing. I have no explanation for that. I have some, I can theorize, but it was so nice to do GDP, and then one different from 2007, the GDP growth per capita, and it was a very nice factor also to have. Big frustration. Why did not continue? Maybe this is for future research. I was very curious for that. This is a limitation, I would say. Why this factor, which is so well followed, didn't continue after 2007, and I think it's related to the framing of the problem, the problematic of the problem, wording, how it was presented. But I think those two policy drivers and this on the GDP, it's the biggest limitation, I would say.
Thank you. I think we have a room for one final, very brief question by one of our external members of the opposition, and I would ask Lei to ask her second question.
Thank you very much, and thank you.
With a request for a brief question and a brief answer.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the spirited defense so far. It's been very enjoyable. So very quickly, in your propositions, the 9th one, you have a quote from Sir Dieter Helm, I think he is these days. Energy and climate change policies need not be complicated.
So, sorry, say it again?
Your ninth proposition, from the quote from Helm, energy and climate change policies need not be complicated.
Yes.
Is that something you agree with or disagree with?
I think what frustrated me when I took it from there at the time is that for example, what is happening now in the council with this cap on electricity prices. The idea is to limit the electricity prices, but the way they do it, it's actually having the opposite effect, and they take a solution that would actually have the worst effects, and the devil is in the details. And the way to do it with the inframarginal price would actually call for a lot of caps, which would be negotiations in a way with the national authorities. Where did that cap be and how to do it? That would be super complicated. That would limit to few experts who actually understand what is happening, and how many understand what is the inframarginal cap, and from members of the European Parliament, for example. How do you explain that to them? How do you explain the merit order to them? And this is just some wording which hides a very unsavory solution, and I think there are easier ways to present that. What we have now is simply, the reason for high energy prices is simply we don't have enough supply. That is the reason. It's simple. Not enough supply. It's not speculators. It's not, at least what Acer and ESMA says, is not speculators, but it's simply not enough generation, because it was a lot of it, of the supply was just cut.
So you still have time to finish
Yes. Just quick, just very, very quickly. So I think we shouldn't. There is a need for detail, but I think this can be better structured and particularly better explained to the public opinion and to the for example, members of the parliament, legislators, which are really not experts in the nitty-gritty of the problem.
Thank you. Mr. Bostan, the time scheduled for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes. In the meantime, let's take a closer look at Maastricht University's renowned teaching method, problem-based learning. Once the pro-rector reconvenes the session, we'll tune in and continue the live stream.
Problem-based learning, or PBL. What does that mean exactly? 3 of my fellow students and I will show you around. Every week, we analyze a different case or issue together. We discuss the case and everyone can contribute different perspectives to the group discussion. If we get stuck, our tutor helps us out and suggests what we could do next. I prefer going to the library to prepare. Here, I can focus and I have quick access to books or journals that help me understand the case. Today, I can also train my stitching skills in the Skills Lab, where you can immediately put into practice what you've learned. After a day like this, I like going to the gym to clear my head and get ready for the next day.
At UM, you meet people from all around the world. Hello guys. Some of them are doing their exchange semester here, and they often say that PBL helps them learn and retain things very easily. I can understand why. It's a very active way of learning because you have to bring your own perspective to real-life cases. You have a lot of freedom to manage your time, your studies, your hobbies, and your work. Of course, that also means a lot of responsibility. Right now, for example, I'm arranging my exchange semester in Madrid. How cool is that? In this group session, we're the managers who have to allocate the resources of a real company. This is how we put into practice what we learned this morning. Studying here means being proactive and learning to plan well. Prioritizing and performing well under stress are great skills that help you develop as a person. But now, it's time to grab a coffee at the Student Service Center.
Right now, we're at the Brightlands Camelot campus. Here we can apply knowledge from lectures and tutorials in a practical setting. This helps us understand what we have learned and further develop our lab skills. Today, we're determining the amounts of cholesterol in various products. What I really like is the project periods at the end of each semester, where we complete a full research project. That includes planning, collecting data, analyzing, and presenting the findings. That way we learn how research works and we're able to see what it's like to be a real scientist. After practicals, I have to write a lab report that also helps me process everything I have learned today. UM has a lot of learning spaces where you can work on your own or with other students. This evening, I'm meeting my friends for a movie night organized by the MSP Study Association.
If you study law, you have to read quite a lot. Not all information is relevant, so you learn how to easily find the information you need to solve your case. In the afternoon, I have to give a presentation, so I like to practice it with a fellow student. Later today, a lawyer is giving a lecture. This will help us better understand the case we're working on. Speaking in front of a group is quite exciting the first time round, but you get used to it quickly. And having to present helps you also to adopt knowledge better. What I like the most is that we sometimes get to enter a plea in front of a real judge. These moot courts are really exciting. Now it's time for drinks with friends. Studying is important, but so is relaxing once in a while.
Mike Bostan. The degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense in view of its positive verdict, and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Christensen is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
All right, please.
Mike Bostan. Before we can proceed, I need you to give the oath, which means you have to answer the following question. Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times? To be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
Good. By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Mike Bostan, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with a degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's difficult to file, I can tell you that. Let me give a short laudatio. Dear Mike, dear Dr. Bostan, as we now should call you, heartfelt congratulations also from both of us supervisors. I'm giving this laudatio on behalf of Ana Herranz-Sorales and myself. The award of a doctoral title is always a great achievement, and is so especially for someone in your position, who has been doing all the work that is involved in this kind of project, identifying the key questions, framing the analysis, collecting the data, writing the papers, dealing with feedback from supervisors, presenting at conferences, submitting to journals, and finally preparing for this defense, who has done all this on top of working in a demanding full-time job and starting a new family. It's hard to imagine how you've managed to juggle these many different responsibilities. And while I'm sure you had fantastic support from your partner Ines, it certainly must have been a great challenge. As a participant in our PhD program for professionals, you had to work on your PhD in the evenings, devote time on the weekends, and sacrifice holidays to be able to make this progress. Given these circumstances, it is easy to understand that this trajectory, as we call it, took time to reach its goal. I'm sure you did not expect that it would last some 6 years to complete this project. And who knows whether you would have embarked on it had you foreseen that. This is a considerable period of time, even more so for someone like you who has been in the early stages of a promising career in the private sector. And so it not only took great commitment and discipline to focus on a part-time PhD over such an extended period of time, but also stamina and devotion to persevere with the project all the way to its initially uncertain conclusion. And it's not as if the world stood still in the time that you worked on the PhD. Both professionally and personally, you have experienced huge, life-changing transformations during this time. You changed your day job, moving from pan-European interest representation in the energy sector to working for a consultancy in the area of energy financing, a high voltage, sorry the pun, that I understand involves intercontinental phone calls in the middle of the night, providing time-sensitive advice on multi-billion-dollar deals, and developing financial solutions for your clients. Furthermore, to say that the topic of your investigation, which we have just discussed, has evolved during the time of your doctoral research would be a massive understatement. 7 years ago, the world was a different place when it comes to the security of energy supply, the pricing of electricity, or debates about governmental interventions in the markets, all important aspects of your thesis. You've been working on a veritable moving target. And while that surely adds to the difficulty of the task, it also means that you're now well equipped to understand better the regulatory dynamics in the sector you work in. When it comes to your personal life, there have also been big changes, but of an infinitely more pleasant kind. Your marriage with Ines, the move into a new home, and the birth of your daughters Emma and Sophie. Again, one can only imagine how much time and devotion, and of course wonderful distraction, these changes have involved. Not to mention that we went through a little thing called the global COVID pandemic in the meanwhile, with all the lockdowns, home office work, and other interruptions that this caused. It would have been the most understandable thing in the world to let go of the PhD project in the context of all these changes and challenges. But, and that is something that we both really wanted to emphasize here, you never lost the motivation to bring your research to a successful conclusion. Indeed, you demonstrated from the beginning until the very end an irrepressible enthusiasm for this project. For us as supervisors, it's been very satisfying to witness how you always reacted to critical comments with a renewed purpose, how you approached each new obstacle with the same eagerness to overcome it, and how reaching each milestone, publications of your articles, conference presentations, and so on, recharged your batteries. We've been very impressed with your positive attitude and your unwavering commitment throughout your time as a PhD fellow. Mike, today is your day, and you fully deserve the attention that is given to your research and the accolades that you receive for being awarded the PhD. But I'm sure you will permit me, and indeed I think you will want to join me, in also thanking Anna for the enormous amount of work that she has done in supervising this doctoral thesis. I'm myself no expert in EU energy policy, but fortunately Anna is one of the leading scholars in the field. And it's thanks also to you, Anna, that both Mike and I have learned a lot from you about the complexities of EU energy policy and regulation. And what has been inspiring is not only to your knowledge of the topic, but also your ever-present commitment to supervision and supporting Mike's research. It's been a privilege for me to work together with you in this context, and the credit for successful supervision of the PhD thesis goes above all to you, Anna. Thank you. Having said that, let's put the spotlight back on Dr. Bostan. Mike, congratulations again from both of us. We're very pleased for you and for your family, who I'm sure have supported you throughout this time, and wish you all the success in your future career and life. Best of luck. Thank you. Thank you.
So, dear Dr. Bostan, also on behalf of the Board of Deans, I congratulate you with the honor you have acquired. I would like to thank everyone involved in the opposition, in particular our online guests joining us from Mexico in the middle of the night. I hereby declare this academic ceremony to be ended, and it's now time to celebrate.
Thank you. Yes, pictures. Looks excellent.